Juicy Co-Creators, Lilu here in San Diego. I'm today sitting next to Stewart. Actually, you're quite a force to be reckoned with in this industry. So I had to interview you. I'm discovering more and more about your own journey. And I think it's absolutely amazing to be sitting next to you right now. So I'm looking forward to discovering how you ended up here at TLC, because I've read many things. So tell us in a nutshell what this journey is all about and where it started. In Australia,
Yes.
doing advertising?
Well, it started in Australia. My parents were artists, and of the mostly starving variety. And my dad went off to the war and got hurt and came back and died. And so I ended up at a fancy boarding school because I won a scholarship. I was rebellious because it was very structured and my parents had been artists. I went off to Sydney University. I ran the university newspaper with a famous Australian, Robert Hughes, who wrote a book called A Fatal Shore. I worked with a fellow called Bryce Courtney, who wrote The Power of One. And but I went into advertising because I was interested in photography. That was the art in me. And I solved the problem of being poor. I ended up with enough stuff to start my own world. I had a bright orange Porsche Audi with an orange racing suit, and I was totally cool. Except on the inside, I still felt like that little boy getting teased and beaten in boarding school. And I suddenly realized that there's this moment where you've removed all of the perceived causes of your unhappiness, yet your unhappiness continues. And that was a crisis. And my wife, who has since passed on, gave me a copy of a book by J. Krishnamurti called Think on These Things. And then on an assignment, I ended up on the corner of Haight and Ashbury in San Francisco in 1971, where if you just breathed the air, you got stoned, you know. And I thought, gee, it's like I'm not in Kansas anymore. I'm not in Sydney anymore. And I ran into a fellow called Werner Erhardt, and we started a thing called EST. And, I'd come to the United States for 2 weeks, and I'm still here, 41 years later, 42 years later.
Tell us what was S training about at the time, because there's a lot of different information going on about it.
Well, in its simplest form, it was you're responsible for the quality of your own experience. And if you want to change your life, you've got to embrace that responsibility. And for me, that was very timely because I'd had the personal experience that you do, in fact, create your internal experience. That what happens inside you is dependent upon the people you let into the room of your life and the stories that you make up about all of that and how you interpret events and the decisions you make and the meaning you attach. And so you're responsible for that process. It doesn't happen to you. For most people, it just happens to you. Because they just bounce through life. And life's what happens while they're making other plans, I think was John Lennon said that. So I knew that. So when I got here in America and Esalen was starting and, there was EST and there were just so many things going on, a chance to be part of that was a chance to be part of the revolution. There's all the stuff going on at UC Berkeley. I mean, it just was a melting point of social reformulation. And we tried to change society and it hadn't worked out, so we're in the let's change ourselves.
How did this kind of training changed over time? Because I know it was a little bit too hard on people or something, and then it got transformed, because part of it, I guess, at the core is taking 100% responsibility for our life, right?
Yes. Yeah, and that's a little harsh for people. The problem with most movements is the people who start them actually get it, which was the S jargon for what it was about. You had to get it. But what happens is that the whole process gets turned into a belief system by people who continue to teach it or people who continue to participate in it. And I was with Eckhart Tolle recently, who Eckhart is the power of now. He said, somebody asked him, well, what brand of therapy do you think is the best? And he said, if you can be present, totally present with another person as a therapist or a teacher, anything you do will work. If you cannot be present, nothing that you do will work. Yeah. And so what happens in all of these things, you see it in religion, you see it in great movements, is it's started by people who have the ability to be totally present. Mm-hmm. And then it gets diluted by people who don't have that ability. And so then it gets to be not what it once was, and then the trouble starts, and the legends start, and they're not always good. But EST in its time was the right thing in the right place. It was totally wonderful. And Werner was, one of the great minds, like a lot of us had conflicted, but, and really a very, very bright guy. I miss the conversations we used to have with each other in the wee small hours terribly.
What is at the core of those teachings, or what you have learned during that time and now that you still take with you, or that you still apply, really, and it's part of kind of how you live these days?
Yes, so, at the core of it is you are responsible. I define entrepreneurship, for example, as taking responsibility for outcomes. It's not about how do you make money, that's what CFOs are for, but entrepreneurship is, I have this dream, I'm going to turn it into reality. So it really is about this idea of being responsible, this idea of being creative, but not just by yourself, It does take a village most of the time. I'm really clear that anything that's worthwhile cannot be done alone. But my current passion, and I realize what my passion has always been, I love to be with people who are doing what they love, who are really, really good at it, who are committed to becoming masters at it, and who are committed to teaching other people to be good at doing something that they love and becoming masters at it. That's what I care about. And when you're with people like that, it's just a different experience. I mean, you live almost in a state of bliss almost all the time. So I heard people saying, well, I love to come to TLC because that's when I can get to be myself and I have this experience. I have to say, for my wife and myself, our experience is like that almost all the time. I mean, you have some days when it's not. But it's about being with people who are up to something, who are taking responsibility for creating something that matters to them. And that was always the teaching.
Did you had to make some difficult choices sometimes? And because in life we have those choices obviously to make, and sometimes we do it and we regret because the family is not the one that we put at the core of our life, and then later on we're like,
So yeah, we all have those difficult choices to make. But I was reading an article recently by a hospice nurse, and she said the number one regret people have as they're approaching death is, I wished I had have had the courage to live a life true to myself rather than the life everybody else wanted me to live. And I can say that I've had that courage my whole life. Now, sometimes you meet a lot of opposition, sometimes you meet conflict. But at the end of the day, I'm a passionately curious man, and I've had the foolishness, I think of foolishness rather than courage, or the rebelliousness rather than courage, to walk to the tune of my own drummer and to follow that passionate curiosity wherever it's taken me. But it's always taken me in the same direction, loving people who are doing something they love and who are really good at it in any field. It doesn't matter what the field is.
when family or friends are seeing transformation with one, with their loved ones, they kind of say, well, what you got yourself into, and why are you so selfish for pursuing that? And you went into a cult, you've changed, and there's all this kind of like pushiness about it. What do you say then?
Well, see, it's a personal choice. You're going to keep going. Lynn Twist, I don't know who interviewed Lynn, but Lynn is one of the world's great women. She's doing this magnificent work with Nobel Prize Peace Laureate women who've won that prize. And she sat down with her family recently because she thought she needed to apologize because what always looked like the priority in her life was the work she did in the Hunger Project, the work she did with Mother Teresa, a lot of work like that, the work she's doing in the Amazon. And her children looked at her and said, Mum, we are so proud of you that you had the courage to live the life that mattered to you, and you've given us mentorship and a model of how to live our lives in a way that counts for something. So sometimes, if you just push through, the family get through it. And you give them courage that they wouldn't have had otherwise, because they watch you change, they watch you hang in there, they watch you cope with the difficulty, and it gives them space to realize, you know what, I could live the life I want to live now. I can make the choices for myself that I want to make. I can be responsibility for creating the happiness and the joy and the prosperity, whatever that is that matters to people, that I want. And so I think that the act of courage is the act of love, in this sense, where that quote really is true. Don't ask what the world needs, ask what brings you fully alive, go do it.
But when the push is really strong around us, when it's really, really hard, it takes even more courage, and some people back up. And
Some people do. There's no easy answer to that. Otherwise, it wouldn't be difficult, would it? It's like if it was easy, more people would do it.
Yeah.
And so, what we tell people is, if you want to change your life, sometimes you've got to change all of the people in your life. I know that's scary, but sometimes you do. I mean, one thing that made it easy for me is I changed countries. So I went from Australia, where everybody knew me the way I used to be, because I came back from a world tour after reading that book, and I had all of these psychic experiences, amazing experiences. I was directing cinematography for a series of Pepsi-Cola commercials. And so it was just an amazing experience of knowing where a location was in France, and I'd never been there before, but saying, well, it's so many kilometers there and you turn right. And we did that, and it was, and we're going to pack up. And I said, no, the sun's going to come out in 3 hours, and it did. So it just was extraordinary. And I was having an inner experience that couldn't be explained by external reality, that was carrying over into external reality. So I remember going back to Australia and people looking at me say, oh, come and have a beer. You'll be your old self in no time. And I didn't want to be my old self. I liked the new one more. And so when I came to the United States, I really did leave everything. I left the business that was very successful. I left friends. I was here for a few months without my wife and son. But I now was in a country that had no idea how to relate to me. Plus I was Australian, which was fashionable at the time. And so I had tremendous freedom. But I had to take the risk to do that. So now, having gotten into that, having started this, I can now collect around me people who are committed to living their life in a decent way. I mean, not with mindless narcissism and unrelenting selfishness, but people who were up to something. And the thing about any of those movements when you start them is the people at the leading edge are up to something. They're looking for a way to be responsible. They're looking for a way to make a difference in the world. Mm-hmm. So that spawns amazing things. The Hunger Project was one of them. There are a number of things. The Pachamama Alliance was one of them. You look at the things going in TLC, the movements that are spawning. Yeah. But it all started with, okay, I'm going to take responsibility, and now I'm going to keep the company of people who are up to that. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And sometimes you leave family behind, but that's an individual choice. You can't take away from family members their own opportunity to choose or not. And you just have to be lovingly tough-minded about it.
Yeah. So you make, how do you make decisions? How do you make those decisions? Based on what?
I make decisions upon what my own internal values are. So what's important to me? And we've talked about that several times now. So I say, does this choice take me in more in that direction, or does it take me away from that? When we do company interventions, we work out what the company values really are, and we say, okay, does this business choice, is that aligned with these values, or is it not aligned? If it's not aligned with the values, don't do it. And see, most people don't choose for their values. They don't choose for their passions, so they have unhappy lives. You've got to choose in favor of your passions. You've got to choose in favor of what matters to you. You've got to live a life aligned with your values.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It seems like it's a quantum leap at times, huh?
It is a quantum leap. I mean, they say growing old isn't for sissies. Transformation isn't for sissies either. So I think some of us choose it before it gets too painful. For myself to have removed, having come from poverty, the perceived causes of my unhappiness, and have the unhappiness continue, I mean, people commit suicide when they land in that situation. And I think God was gracious when I got given a copy of Think on These Things, because it addressed the very things we've been talking about. Krishnamurti was quite the guy once upon a time. And it was a perfect book for me at the perfect time. But, as that old saying, when the student is ready, the teacher appears, and the teacher was that book. But I was in the middle of that personal crisis. And I think it would be nice if the world doesn't always require a crisis, or a person doesn't always require a crisis for change to be initiated, but often that's the case. I mean, we like to think that if enough of us change, then there'll be like the 100th monkey phenomena. Mm-hmm. We'll get this core critical mass. But I don't know. I think it's been like this since time began, actually.
I was going to ask you, and I had this conversation with Carolyn Miss, that is quite
Yes,
pessimistic about that. So
yes.
how do you feel? How do you feel this is different to where it was at in the 70s?
Um, well, one thing is interesting. I think that in the 70s, people like myself rebelled against the established order. And we became like outrageous in many ways. I watch my son, who's 47. He's more conservative than I ever was. I mean, he's become like the people we rebelled against in the 70s. He's very conservative. So I watched it change, but I think that the undercore, the undercurrent, the things at the heart of it all don't ever change. I think there's different manifestations, but I think each time we're moving in a direction of goodness. I just was talking by a man who's a partner of Muhammad Yunus, called Mark Thornton, and I was saying, so how do you think Arab Spring's going to land? He said, oh, it's going to turn out in a good way. And we started to talk about all the reasons why. There is a quickening. Things are moving up. So you can't always see the progress because change and transformation is messy. And sometimes in the middle of the mess, you can't see that you're making progress. But I think we are making progress. And of course, we need to.
Yes. So you think we're in this shift right now, and this shift has
Well, I think we've been in it for a while. I mean, I think humanity's always in a shift, but I think it's quickening. Everything's getting faster. You know, with the internet and access to information, the truth rises to the surface much more quickly now. And I think when the truth rises to the surface much more quickly, then the process of transformation quickens also. And I see that going on.
But it feels like a lot of things are coming up, and a lot of things of people that are malintentions are bringing stuff up about people that are doing the good work also. So it seems like it's very much a time where we need to find our inner strength and really go deeper and deeper and deeper than ever.
I agree totally. And you know, what you just described as a phenomena has been going on for as long as recorded history. You know, if we read history, we know that's always been the case. I think it's just messier now because you hear about it more immediately now. So it's more overwhelming now. And, you know, unfortunately, we have a media, I don't say this to you pejoratively, but we have a media that makes its living selling bad news. Yeah. And so you hear about the negative exceptions. But I interviewed Dr. Robert Mueller, who described himself as an optimist by choice. Now, he had been a member of the Resistance in France, captured by the Nazis, survived, and said he survived because his parents and his grandparents had taught him that he had dominion over his inner experience no matter what the external circumstances were. And he wrote a little book called Most of All They Taught Me Happiness. So he's a country person of yours. Mm-hmm. And I said, so how would I describe you? He said, you describe me as an optimist by choice. And this is when the United Nations was in disarray and the Club of Rome said life as we know it on this planet will be gone by the year 2010. Well, we passed that year. So there was very little optimism. And it was the year that the space probe went out with the platinum capsule with art and artifacts of humankind. And so I said, what's an optimist by choice? He said, well, first let's start with a pessimist. Or let's start with an optimist who's just automatically an optimist. They're a person who refuses to confront the possibility that evil exists in the world. So in a Pollyanna-ish way, they pretend nothing bad can possibly happen and God won't let it occur. He said, but that gave us a Holocaust. People didn't believe that could actually be happening or that God would let that happen. He said, then there's the pessimist, the other side of the same coin, where the pessimist feels that so many of their dreams have been shattered in their lifetime that they dare not hope for anything good. So for them, the only surprise they ever get is a pleasant one. He said, but it's the front of my hand, the back of my hand, the heads and tails of a coin. He said, an optimist by choice requires that you wake up every morning willing to live from the point of view that ultimately the divinity of the human spirit will prevail. Now, he said, it doesn't actually matter whether that's true or not. There's no point arguing over if that's true. He said, because if nobody lives as if it were, it certainly can't be. And if enough of us live as if it were, it may just turn out to be true. And in the meantime, I can't think of any other sensible or sane way to live. And that was one of the most moving interviews that I've ever done. And so I have an autographed copy of the book in a pride of place on my bookshelf. And I think that's how I live in the world. I'm an optimist by choice. You know, I'm willing to look at the dark side. And I don't know any other way to live than that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for this interview.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
I truly enjoy this. Thank you, my delicious co-creators, for watching, for sharing, for supporting. I love you. Big, big kisses from San Diego. Overcast San Diego.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And got hurt and came back and died. And so I ended up at a fancy boarding school because I won a scholarship. I was rebellious because it was very structured and my parents had been artists. I went off to Sydney University. I ran the university newspaper with a famous Australian, Robert Hughes, who wrote a book called A Fatal Shore. I worked with a fellow called Bryce Courtney, who wrote The Power of One. And but I went into advertising because I was interested in photography. That was the art.
Juicy co-creators, Lilu here in San Diego. I'm today sitting next to Stewart. Actually, you're quite a force to be reckoned with in this industry. So I had to interview you. I'm discovering more and more about your own journey, and I think it's absolutely amazing to be sitting next to you right now. So I'm looking forward to discovering how you ended up here at TLC, because I've read many things. So tell us in a nutshell what this journey is all about and where it started. In Australia,
Yes.
doing advertising?
Well, it started in Australia. My parents were artists, and of the mostly starving variety. And my dad went off to the war, and that was a crisis. And my wife, who has since passed on, gave me a copy of a book by J. Krishnamurti called Think on These Things. And then on an assignment, I ended up on the corner of Haight and Ashbury in San Francisco in 1971, where if you just breathed the air, you got stoned, you know. And I thought, gee, it's like I'm not in Kansas anymore. I'm not in Sydney anymore. And I ran into a art in me, and I solved the problem of being poor. I ended up with enough stuff to start my own world. I had a bright orange Porsche Audi with an orange racing suit, and I was totally cool. Except on the inside, I still felt like that little boy getting teased and beaten in boarding school. And I suddenly realized that there's this moment where you've removed all of the perceived causes of your unhappiness, yet your unhappiness continues.